I would like to thank all of you for providing me with this opportunity to interact with the body of scholars par excellence. Coming back to the Government College, University of Lahore is the experience of déjà vu, because I've taught here for almost 6 years and I have been associated with the academic world for almost a decade now. All right, so let's start off with A Bend in the River. Very first thing that we do in a literature classroom is to analyze what it stands for. So there are two sets of opinion about A Bend in the River. According to one set of critics, A Bend in the River is a symbol, which means that Africa is in a defining moment. It's a transitional phase. Either it's going to enter into modernity or it's going to go back into primitiveness. So, but as things stand, the journey has not yet been decided, and this is the symbolic meaning of A Bend in the River. I'm going to employ Stuart Hall's perspective to analyze A Bend in the River, because he has come up with a word which is very important in the world of theory, and he has categorized V.S. Naipaul, who is the author of A Bend in the River, as what? He has called him a comprador intellectual. Many of you might not be familiar with the term comprador intellectual. The Western writers who are self-styled and who have studied in the West and who are trying to serve the commercial interest of the West, which is known as predatory capitalism, they are known as comprador intellectuals. They pretend to act as cultural intermediaries, but what they actually do is they always have a colonial trajectory. They have their leanings which are going to support the West, and they would be undermining the cause of the East. So, not only V.S. Naipaul, according to the first set of opinion, is going to be accused of having an essentialist representation of the African continent. He has also come up with Orientalist bashing, and these are the terms that I have taken from Edward Said, because he will say that a text, in being a text, is a being in the world. So we would be looking at the unconscious of this text today, and the two sets of opinion which are very dominant about A Bend in the River. All right, I hope I have tried to make my position clear. You might ask me this question, that what is the importance of having a comprador intellectual? He is there to destroy all known Western ways of knowing. And from the perspective of Gayatri Spivak, this is known as epistemic violence. Epistemic violence is a term which means that if you destroy known Western ways of thinking, the only ways of thinking that would be left would be Western. So let's talk about A Bend in the River from the post-colonial prism, so that we can identify the spaces of activism which have recently not been activated, all right? And we won't be looking at the history from the prism of the colonizer, we'll be looking at it from the prism of the colonized. If you have seen that the focal person of the novel, Salim, have you read this novel, all of you? All right, I'm going to brief you about the novel, and then by the end we'll be able to thrash out a conclusion, but it's going to be based on the critical canons debate. All right, so what's the point of coming here with your own personal projections if you're not aware of what this scholarly panel was actually up to? Salim is a person who actually is trying to hover between two different cultures. He is originally an African, but he does not get recognition in the African world, because he say, I was born in Africa, but I came from the East Coast, and that has made all the difference. So the people in Africa would always judge him for being an Arab Muslim, and that is the crisis of identity which gets deepened, and all his consciousness is going to be shaped as a result of the European books that he has read. All right, so the European books have an influence on him. He is going to exhibit a pro-European slant in his outlook, and this is directly the result of the educational influences that he had there. And on the other hand, when he actually relocates to England, the English people are going to mistreat him for being an African. Now try imagining that you are Salim, you get rejected in Africa for being an Arab Muslim, and you get rejected in England for being an African. So it means he is a universal outsider. He is going to be regarded as an outcast. In English we call him a pariah. This is how the story begins. Then the story moves on towards Inda, someone who is going to come up with an insensitive remark. He would say, Salim, you don't have any place here. you are a homeless person. So this racially charged remark is going to cast a very negative impression on the central character. We keep moving on, and B.S. Naipaul has come up with a description of Africa. He would call it a dead civilization. Now just imagine that if your civilization is going to be categorized as dead, what are its going to be implications? It means that you are never going to make a transition towards modernity, all right? And you are going to remain stagnant. As one of the leading critics who has established his criticism on this novel, he would say that entire cultures are on the move. People are psychologically displaced. They are physically bewildered, and they are homeless, stateless, and cultureless. So this is what we are trying to understand in the course of the debate that is going to take place. If I move on from the Inder's remark, I'm also going to show you what V.S. Naipaul has said about Africa. He will say that when you travel in Africa at the night, it's as if the land is going to take you back. Now, taking back in post-colonial terms has very dark connotations. It means that you are going to return to the colonizer. It's the nostalgia for the past. It means that a person is never able to negotiate with the clutches of the empire. When I employ the word empire, I'm referring to the colonizer, England, because England is the authority that had the audacity to culturally invade an entire territory and then displace them, all right? So this entire episode is meant to rip into the empire as well as a colonizer, so that you can understand that there is also a narrative that's going to be coming from the oppressed. All of you start thinking different matters from the lens of the empire, and in post-colonialism we call it Eurocentrism. Have you ever come across the word Eurocentrism? It means looking at things from the spectacles of the empire. So we need to undo Eurocentrism, and this is what post-colonialism is all about. It's a hopeful discourse, and it's going to show you the possibilities which you can't imagine in normal life. I'm going to take you on and tell you that the central character Salim, while he is living in Africa, he comes across a very painful reality that the people who have been studied in England, they get a preferential treatment just because they have a foreign schooling. So if you have foreign schooling, you are going to get a preferential treatment. And if you are a native African, you are going to be cast off. So that is the problem with Salim, all right? Another episode which is very important, Africa is trying to negotiate because they have been living under the colonial rule. So what they actually want is they want to have democracy in place. But unfortunately, the democracy, when it comes into being, the black president becomes the president for lifetime. Is this a real version of democracy? My personal commentary would be that democracy has to be democratized, all right? Because this is an illusion of democracy. In democracy, you can't remain the president for lifetime. If you would be the president for lifetime, probably this is, you're living under the umbrella of autocracy or dictatorship, but you are giving the impression as if it's democracy, all right? So the president for lifetime is known for doing different things. I'm going to tell you how they are going to commit different atrocities. For example, when Salim is trying to travel in different parts of Africa, there was an episode when the president was speaking and Salim tried to interject him, and the president put down his stick. What were the connotations of putting the stick down and then biting his lips? It meant that I'm going to put down my foot on the authority, and in the ancient times, if the dictator is going to put down the stick, it means that that person should be liquidated, put off the very next moment. So just imagine a person who is pretending to be a Democrat, who is giving the impression that he is going to come out of the state of retrogression and is going to make a transition towards progression. But if someone tries speaking with him, he puts down the stick so that that person could be killed. So what sort of a transition Africa actually had? So the leading critics would say that it was a journey from foreign tyranny to local tyranny. It was not a true transition in the true sense of the word. Had it been an actual transition, he would have acted as a true Democrat. While the photo session was taking place, the president would come up with his enlarged photographs, whereas ordinary Africans would be zoomed out, but the foreigners would get equal space with the president. It means that anyone who would be looking up to England for enlightenment and who would be having the views of the colonizer, he would be getting the preferential treatment, and the people who try to somehow engage with the apparatus of the colonizer, they would be thrown out. So a bend in the river is very important to discuss because there are some similarities that might be drawn between Pakistan as well as Africa. We are also a third world country. We are also facing economic depression, economic meltdown. People are psychologically displaced, facing identity crisis. Because if you live according to your national identity, probably people are going to cast you off. But the moment you try acting like a colonizer or someone who is educated in England, you get a different treatment altogether. All right? So probably one of the ways to understand the Pakistani dilemma and the predicament would be to analyze this novel from different perspectives. Just like I have told you one side of the spectrum, now I'm going to take you to another side of the spectrum, which is going to change the debate altogether. How many of you know that Zabbath, a character in the novel, he was schooled in England, and Inder was schooled in England, and that was probably one of the reasons that Salim could not get the same treatment as both these characters would get. Are you familiar with these things? Let me take you to the other side of the picture. I'm going to quote a line which is probably one of the most important remarks if you want to understand A Bend in the River. One of the critics would say that Salim says in this novel, I don't know to what extent my civilization is my imprisonment. This is a very important remark. Civilization should not act as someone's imprisonment. It should be a liberating force. It should be able to emancipate you from the clutches of the empire. But the Africans, they could not offer resistance to the West. And just because they could not offer resistance to the West, it means that somehow they were trapped, and this sort of quandary that they were in, I would call it a catch-22 situation. All right? If you have read the novel 1984, you come across a character known as the Big Brother. Have you read 1984? Who is going to come up with moral policing as well as thought policing. He won't let you think on independent lines, on individual lines. And this instance is known as indoctrination. There are few characters that are going to be indoctrinated. If you are not let lose your imagination, if you're not allowed to express yourself independently and critically, and somehow you are being controlled, you will never be able to decolonize yourself. Are we on the same wavelength? Because I get the impression as if you are shell-shocked. You should have read the novel, only then you will be able to celebrate its intricacies, its strengths as well as weaknesses, all right? Any study session that you attend is essential that not only you read the novel, you also develop your critique on it. Then you will be able to understand what the speaker is trying to put across to you. So let's move on to a few other things. While I told you that someone's civilization can also act as imprisonment, there are other instances that are also going to shape your consciousness in different ways. For example, Salim said that it was Europe that introduced us to the truth, but it was Europe that introduced us to the lie as well. Can you understand the shift in the perspective? The same person who was glorifying England throughout his life, he was looking at England as the savior. When he actually went to England, he came up with 3 different adjectives. He said that the airplane that brought me to Europe was not the Europe that I envisioned in my life. The reality of England is mean, it's forbidden, and it's shrunken. 3 different adjectives are being employed. So just imagine the change of perspective. And what do we call this in literature? This is Bildungsroman. This is the character development, the character formation. If a person is going to have enlargement of his vision, if someone is going to change his initial perception, if there is going to be a light bulb moment, a turning point in someone's life, that is going to change someone's perception altogether. This whole process is known as Bildungsroman. And in one of the leading criticisms, you will come across that Salim is normally marginalized. He's being shown as a person who is racially persecuted, someone who is living on the margins, someone who is on the fringes. But what are you going to see? You're going to come across Salim, who is actually a transformed figure by the end of the novel. There are two types of Bildungsroman. One is the, someone would say Kanzlerroman, Erziehungsroman. Another type is sexual Bildungsroman. And Salim experiences a normal kind of Bildungsroman as well as sexual. Because the president for lifetime had a white spokesperson who is known as Raymond. And the moment the lady Violet is going to dump the white spokesperson, that is the most important metaphor according to the critics. Because if you dump the furniture that was gifted to you by the white man on a symbolic plane, that would mean that you have dumped the colonizer, all right? And the relationship that Salim had with Violet is going to set the course of the entire novel. And that was a relationship that was defined by an emotional roller coaster, because initially their relationship was blossoming, but as time advanced, their relationship actually became frosty and it became strained. And same is the case with the relationship between the colonizer and the colonized. All right? You also come across instances when Salim, after having his Bildungsroman, the moment of enlightenment, the light bulb moment, when he's going to change his perspective altogether about England, he would start talking ills of England. And he would say that the reality of England is not different from the reality of Africa. It means that throughout my life, I have been living blind. Living blind is the phrase employed by V.S. Naipaul. So England has been categorized as a hoax. It's a sham place. The reality of England is fleeting. What's the meaning of the word fleeting? It means something which is momentary, something that is evanescent, that does not last long. We call it fleeting. So Salim had fleeting moments. Initially, he started off his life in Africa, but there he could not get acceptance, although he tried to acclimatize himself according to the African ways, but he would always be cast off due to his Arab descent. And when he actually went to England, the right word would be relocate. When he relocated to England, then he get cast off for being an African. So a person who is a universal outsider, who has had an experience, in literature we call it a dynamic character. I hope you understand the difference between a flat character and a dynamic character. A flat character does not undergo any transition. He is going to end up the same place where he actually started from. But in the case of a dynamic character, there is going to be a transformation, and he is going to have a moment which is going to enlarge his consciousness. His perception is going to change. So we are discussing the change in the perceptual framework. Many of the critics would say that V.S. Naipaul's fictional alter ego is Salim himself. It means he is the mouthpiece or the spokesperson who is going to speak for V.S. Naipaul. Now, there are two different sets of opinion. One set of critics would say that V.S. Naipaul is an apologist of the West. He's trying to give preference to the colonizer's vision. This is what Professor Masood Raja would say, who has recently resigned from his position, who acted as the associate professor at the University of North Texas. All right? When he wrote an article on A Bend in the River, he came up with the position that there are binaries have been shown in this novel, but the colonialist picture is being given preference over the picture of the colonized. But there is another side of the picture as well, and I'm going to show you that side of the picture. Then we are going to indulge in a lively debate. And that picture is, V.S. Naipaul also says in the novel, probably if I had to pick one sentence from that novel, that would be, many false gods have come to this land, but none have been as false as the gods of today. And he says that the teachers, the priests, and the people associated with Africa, they could not live up to their national duties. And that's why Africa, instead of making a progression, has actually headed towards retrogression. Retrogression is the opposite of progression. It means heading backwards. So Africa under the black president is just pretending to be making a transition. It's a smoke screen of development, but things have got worse when the local African has come to the throne. But just imagine for a while V.S. Naipaul saying that the teachers as well as the priests have not lived up to their national duties, and they were the false gods. And one time he would say that the ancestors are shrieking in the graves because the ancestors actually wanted Africa not to remain in a state of political inertia and to be actually able to democratize the whole system. So the other side of the picture says that V.S. Naipaul is not only blaming the colonizer for coming up with a colonizing mission, which is coming in the guise of a civilizing mission. How many times people of English literature are going to confront two different terms, colonizing mission as well as civilizing missions? And these are just fancy words for communicating the same things. But actually, this is not a civilizing mission. This was a colonizing mission, and the critics of post-colonialism can see through the ruse, they can see through the deception, and that's why they have been able to celebrate this text from different dimensions. Now, one of the questions which I'm going to ask all of you is, and this is mentioned in one of the criticism, can we actually transcend the text? Can we go out of the scope of the text? Or shall we be remaining within the confines of that text? It's very difficult to transcend from the limitations. For this, you have to be a critic of the highest repute so that you can come up with your personal criticism. The things that I have discussed with you about this novel have included, the first one was Stuart Hall's concept of comprador intellectual, and this is the allegation that is being leveled on V.S. Naipaul. I have told you that comprador intellectual is a person who is trying to give privilege to the colonial version of things, and he is trying to let down the African side of things. The other things that I included, Spivak's term epistemic violence, which means destroying all non-Western ways of thinking so that we can privilege only the Western ways of thinking. And probably the other thing that I discussed with you was the two sets of critics and their interpretations of the same thing. A bend in the river itself is quite an obscure imagery, because I told you that by the end of this novel, when the central character Salim is trying to escape from the mundane African reality because he was sent to imprison and the African president ordered that he should be killed. At that point in time, it was Ferdinand who rescued his life. How could Ferdinand rescue him? Because Ferdinand studied in the state domain. One of the most important themes as far as A Bend in the River is concerned is the theme of state domain. It was set up as an educational place, but there the people who would be teaching there and the people who would be studying there, what are they going to do? They would just try to look at things from the European spectacles. And this is what we should not be doing. Instead of looking at things from the European spectacles, it's far more advisable. Look at things from your native spectacles so that you can connect with different versions of reality. All right? So, unfortunately, in the last scene, Ferdinand was able to rescue Salim from getting murdered. And when all the passengers actually stepped on board so that they could escape themselves from the tyranny of the African black president. He was just black as far as skin is concerned, but he was actually acting as the instrument of colonization. So when the entire ship came close to the center of the river, V.S. Naipaul didn't give us an ending, and critics say that our sense of epistemophilia is being perverted. Dictionary defines epistemophilia in different ways. One of the dictionaries would say that this is a love of learning. Another dictionary would say that the impulse to know is epistemophilia. All readers, while we are reading a text, we try to look for an ending. But one of my teachers is nowadays teaching in US. He would say that the greatest text is not the one that is going to come up with a resolution of conflicts. It's the one that further compounds our judgment or conflates our judgment, like this one, because this ending is being left to readers' imagination. Now, readers' presuppositions, the readers' ideological baggage, and the readers' biases are going to decide that what's going to happen with Africa. If the ship cruises forward and cruises through the battles and difficulties, that would in post-colonial terms mean that Africa is actually able to move towards development. And if the ship sinks, that means that the African dream is also going to be shattered alongside. All right? So that's how we actually examine things from different perspectives. Another instance that I would like to share with you is there anyone who has read this novel? Or not a single one? Now this is going to be quite flummoxing. I'm slightly flummoxed because if you are going to engage with students who have not studied the novel, it means that even if I share anything with you, you have to accept it at face value, because you're not in a position to disagree with me or challenge my point of view. All right? I thought someone would be able to come up with an antithesis or a counter argument. So you have placed me at a so high pedestal that even if I quote another novel, I can easily claim that I'm quoting this from A Bend in the River. So thank you for placing me at such a high pedestal. I consider myself more important than B.S. Naipaul at this point in time. He won the Booker Prize in 1971 and Nobel Prize in 2001. Just to tell you about the standing of this person in the literary canon. Author of multiple books. He's a celebrated as well as a controversial figure in the post-colonial world. And we should never be bringing a novel that only discusses things from a limited prism. We should be able to come out of our personal presuppositions. Only then we'll be able to engage with the thematic strands of a novel in entirety. All right? So I'm trying to live up to the guidelines being provided to me. So I stop here, and I want all of you to come up with your questions, your criticisms, your analysis. The house is open for discussions.